Thomas Mitchell had served the British royal family for 23 years. His polished black boots had walked the same marble corridors of Buckingham Palace since he was 19 years old. Every morning he put on his crisp red uniform with the same pride his father had shown when he served the Queen Mother decades earlier. The palace walls held memories of his entire adult life, and Thomas knew every secret passage, every hidden door, and every whispered conversation that echoed through the grand halls. On this particular October morning, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Thomas took his position outside the throne room. His tall frame stood perfectly straight, his white gloves spotless and his ceremonial sword gleaming at his side. To anyone watching, he appeared to be the model of royal protocol and unwavering loyalty. But beneath his composed exterior, Thomas carried a burden that had been growing heavier with each passing day. The news had spread through the palace staff like wildfire the night before. Queen Camilla would be making her first official appearance in the throne room since her recent coronation ceremony. All palace guards had received strict instructions about proper etiquette and the exact words they must use when addressing her. Thomas had read the memo 3 times, each reading making his stomach turn more than the last. He remembered the day Princess Diana had walked these same halls. Thomas had been just a young guard then, but he could still recall her gentle smile and the way she stopped to speak with the staff. She had asked about his family, remembered his name from previous encounters, and always treated everyone with genuine kindness. Diana had possessed a warmth that made the cold palace walls feel like home. When she died in that tragic car accident in Paris, Thomas had wept openly in his small staff quarters, feeling as though he had lost a member of his own family. The years that followed had been difficult for Thomas. He watched as Prince Charles struggled with public opinion and saw how the royal family worked to rebuild their image. Through it all, Thomas remained loyal to his duty, even when his personal feelings conflicted with his professional obligations. He had served through scandals, celebrations, and sorrows, always maintaining the stoic demeanor expected of a palace guard. But today felt different. Today, Thomas would be required to bow and address Camilla with the full honors, due to a queen, the woman who many still blamed for the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. Would walk past him expecting the same respect that had been given to the beloved Queen Elizabeth II and the cherished Princess Diana. The thought made Thomas clench his jaw beneath his perfectly composed expression. As the morning progressed, other guards took their positions around the palace. Thomas noticed the excited whispers among the newer staff members who seemed thrilled about the historic moment they were about to witness. Some had never served under the previous queen and viewed this as just another day of royal ceremony. But for Thomas, this moment represented something much more profound and troubling. The palace's head of security, Commander Harrison, appeared in the corridor. He was a stern man in his 50s who had worked his way up through the ranks and demanded absolute precision from his team. Harrison approached Thomas with measured steps, his expression serious. "Mitchell," Harrison said quietly, "I trust you're prepared for this morning's ceremony. The Queen Consort's first official throne room appearance is significant for the entire palace staff." Thomas nodded curtly. "Yes, sir. I understand the protocol." Harrison studied Thomas's face carefully. The commander had worked with enough guards over the years to recognize when someone was struggling with their duties. He had heard whispers about Thomas's deep admiration for Princess Diana and wondered if today might present challenges. "The royal family values loyalty above all else, Mitchell. Personal feelings must never interfere with professional duty. I hope I can count on you to uphold the standards we've maintained for centuries." "Of course, sir," Thomas replied, though the words felt like stones in his mouth. After Harrison moved on to check with other guards, Thomas found himself alone with his thoughts once again. He tried to focus on his breathing, a technique he had learned during his military training before joining the palace staff. In through the nose, out through the mouth. But even this simple exercise couldn't calm the storm brewing inside his chest. Thomas thought about his father, who had served the royal family with unwavering dedication until his retirement. His father had often spoken about the honor of protecting the monarchy and preserving British traditions. "We serve something greater than ourselves," his father had always said. "We're guardians of history, protectors of a legacy that stretches back centuries." But what happened when that legacy felt tainted? What happened when serving the crown meant betraying your own sense of right and wrong? Thomas had wrestled with these questions for months, and today they demanded an answer. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Palace staff members hurried past, making final preparations for the ceremony. Flowers were being arranged, carpets were being adjusted, and every surface was being polished to perfection. The familiar bustle of royal preparation usually brought Thomas comfort, but today it only heightened his anxiety. A young maid named Sarah, whom Thomas had known since she started working at the palace 5 years earlier, paused near his position. She looked nervous but excited. "Can you believe it, Mr. Mitchell? Our first ceremony with Queen Camilla. It feels like we're watching history unfold." Thomas managed a weak smile. "History indeed, Sarah. History indeed." As Sarah continued on her way, Thomas realized that his decision today would become part of that history. Whatever choice he made in the next few hours would define not only his own future, but also send a message about loyalty, duty, and personal conviction that would echo through the palace for years to come. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on his shoulders as he adjusted his uniform one final time and prepared to face the most challenging moment of his 23-year career. The grand clock in the palace corridor chimed 11 times, signaling that the ceremony would begin in exactly 1 hour. Thomas felt each chime like a hammer blow against his chest. Palace staff rushed around him with increased urgency, carrying silver trays, adjusting decorations, and whispering last-minute instructions to each other. The energy in the air was electric, but for Thomas, it felt more like the calm before a devastating storm. Commander Harrison reappeared, this time accompanied by the deputy head of royal protocol, Mrs. Catherine Whitmore. She was an elegant woman in her 60s who had overseen hundreds of royal ceremonies during her career. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. Mrs. Whitmore had a reputation for being both fair and absolutely unforgiving when it came to breaches of protocol. "Gentlemen," Mrs. Whitmore addressed the guards assembled in the corridor, "today marks a significant moment in British royal history. Queen Camilla's first official throne room ceremony as our sovereign's consort requires your absolute best. Every movement, every gesture, every word must be executed with flawless precision." Thomas listened as she detailed the exact sequence of events. When Queen Camilla entered the throne room, all guards would stand at attention. As she passed, each guard would execute a precise bow and speak the words, "Your Majesty," in acknowledgement of her royal status. The ceremony would last approximately 45 minutes, during which the guards would maintain their positions with military precision. "Any questions?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, her gaze sweeping across the assembled guards. Silence filled the corridor. Thomas wanted to speak, wanted to voice the turmoil raging inside his mind, but his training kept him silent. A palace guard did not question orders. A palace guard served without hesitation or personal preference. After Mrs. Whitmore and Commander Harrison departed, Thomas found himself standing next to James Fletcher, a guard who had joined the palace staff just 2 years earlier. James was young, enthusiastic, and completely devoted to royal tradition. He practically bounced on his toes with excitement. "I can't believe we get to be part of this historic moment," James whispered. "My grandmother would be so proud. She's always said that serving the royal family is the highest honor any British citizen could achieve." Thomas nodded absently, but James's words stirred something uncomfortable in his stomach. He remembered feeling that same pride and excitement when he first put on the uniform. Back then, serving the crown had seemed like the most noble calling imaginable. But now, after years of watching political maneuvering, personal scandals, and public relations campaigns, Thomas questioned whether the institution he served still deserved his unwavering loyalty. The sound of approaching vehicles filtered through the palace windows. Thomas knew that Queen Camilla's motorcade was arriving, bringing her from Clarence House for the ceremony. Soon she would walk through these corridors, expecting the same reverence that had been shown to Queen Elizabeth II for over 70 years. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to summon an image of the late Queen Elizabeth. He remembered her dignified presence, her lifetime of service, and the respect she had commanded from people across the world. Elizabeth had been born into royalty, raised for the throne, and had dedicated every day of her long life to her duties as monarch. She had earned the title of queen through birth, preparation, and decades of faithful service. But Camilla's path to the throne had been different. Thomas couldn't forget the headlines from the 1990s, the leaked phone conversations, the public humiliation of Princess Diana. While he understood that people could change and that marriages sometimes ended, he struggled to reconcile the woman who had been labeled the other woman with the queen he was now expected to honor without question. A commotion near the main entrance caught Thomas's attention. Palace staff were making final adjustments to the red carpet that would guide Queen Camilla from the entrance to the throne room. Everything had to be perfect. Not a single fold in the carpet. Not a speck of dust on the golden fixtures. Not a flower out of place in the elaborate arrangements. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, the head housekeeper, supervised the final preparations with the intensity of a military general. She had worked at the palace for 35 years and had coordinated ceremonies for 3 different monarchs. Nothing escaped her attention, and she demanded absolute perfection from her staff. "The carpet alignment is off by 2 inches on the left side," she called out to a group of footmen. "Adjust it immediately. And someone needs to polish that brass fixture again. I can see fingerprints from here." Thomas watched the meticulous preparations and felt a familiar mixture of pride and frustration. Pride because he was part of an institution that maintained such high standards and preserved centuries-old traditions. Frustration because those same traditions now required him to act against his personal convictions. A soft touch on his arm startled Thomas from his thoughts. Sarah, the young maid he had spoken with earlier, stood beside him with a concerned expression. "Mr. Mitchell, are you feeling all right? You look a bit pale." Thomas forced a smile. "Just pre-ceremony nerves, Sarah. Even after all these years, important occasions still affect me." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I understand completely. I've been working here for 5 years and I still get butterflies before big events. But think about how special this is. We're witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in royal history." As Sarah walked away, Thomas realized that everyone around him seemed genuinely excited about the ceremony. The other guards appeared confident and ready. The staff members moved with purpose and enthusiasm. Even the palace itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Only Thomas stood in the midst of this excitement, feeling like a traitor to his own uniform. The distant sound of car doors closing echoed through the palace walls. Queen Camilla had arrived. In less than 30 minutes, she would begin her procession to the throne room. Thomas would have to make his choice then. Follow the protocol he had sworn to uphold, or take a stand for the principles he believed in, regardless of the consequences. Thomas straightened his shoulders and checked his uniform one final time. His white gloves were spotless. His boots reflected the corridor lights perfectly, and his ceremonial sword hung at precisely the correct angle. To any observer, he looked like the perfect palace guard, loyal, disciplined, and ready to serve. But inside his chest, his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The next 30 minutes would determine whether Thomas Mitchell remained a faithful servant of the crown, or became the palace guard who dared to defy centuries of royal protocol. The moment had arrived. Thomas could hear the soft murmur of voices approaching from the main entrance hall. Queen Camilla had entered the palace and was making her way toward the throne room. Each footstep brought her closer to the corridor where Thomas stood, and with each passing second his decision became more urgent and unavoidable. Commander Harrison appeared one final time, walking briskly down the line of guards positioned along the ceremonial route. His sharp eyes inspected each uniform, each posture, each expression. When he reached Thomas, he paused for just a moment longer than necessary. "Remember, Mitchell, eyes forward, perfect posture, and clear acknowledgement when Her Majesty passes. This ceremony will be photographed and recorded for the royal archives. Your conduct today becomes part of permanent history." Thomas nodded stiffly. "Understood, sir." As Harrison moved on, Thomas felt the weight of those words. Permanent history. Everything that happened in the next few minutes would be preserved forever, documented for future generations to study and analyze. Royal ceremonies were not just public events. They were historical records that captured the relationship between the monarchy and those who served it. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Thomas could distinguish different voices now. Mrs. Whitmore's crisp instructions, the measured pace of the official escort, and underneath it all, a woman's voice that he recognized from countless television interviews and public appearances. Queen Camilla was discussing something about the flower arrangements with one of her ladies-in-waiting, her tone pleasant and conversational. Thomas tried to steady his breathing, but his chest felt tight. Sweat gathered beneath his white gloves despite the cool October air flowing through the palace corridors. He had faced dangerous situations during his military service before joining the palace staff, but none of those moments had felt as terrifying as this one. In combat, the choice between right and wrong had been clear. Today the lines were blurred and Thomas wasn't sure if he was preparing to be a hero or a traitor. James Fletcher, standing at the next position down the corridor, caught Thomas's eye and gave him an encouraging smile. The young guard's enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, Thomas almost felt swept up in the ceremonial grandeur. Almost. Then the procession appeared around the corner, and Thomas's heart nearly stopped. Queen Camilla walked with practiced grace, her elegant navy blue dress perfectly tailored, and her jewelry sparkling under the palace's crystal chandeliers. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate royal protocol over many years. Her silver hair was styled immaculately, and her smile was warm as she acknowledged the staff members lining her route. Mrs. Whitmore walked slightly ahead and to the left, ensuring that every detail of the procession proceeded according to plan. Behind Queen Camilla came her personal secretary, 2 ladies-in-waiting, and a photographer, who discreetly captured moments for the official royal record. As the group approached, Thomas heard the first guard in line execute his required acknowledgement. "Your Majesty." The words were spoken clearly and respectfully, exactly as protocol demanded. Queen Camilla nodded graciously in response and continued forward. The second guard repeated the same process. Then the third. Each interaction was identical, precise, respectful, and perfectly choreographed. This was how royal ceremonies were supposed to work, smoothly, predictably, and without any hint of personal opinion or individual preference. Queen Camilla was now only 4 positions away from Thomas. He could see her face clearly, notice the careful way she acknowledged each guard, and observe how comfortable she appeared in her royal role. She had spent years preparing for this position, learning the expectations and responsibilities that came with being married to the king. 3 positions away, Thomas's hands began to tremble slightly and he gripped his ceremonial sword tighter to steady himself. He thought about his father, who had always emphasized the importance of duty above personal feelings. He thought about his 23 years of faithful service, his spotless record, and his reputation as one of the most reliable guards in the palace. 2 positions away. Thomas could hear Queen Camilla's voice more clearly now, as she made a quiet comment to Mrs. Whitmore about the beautiful condition of the palace corridors. She sounded genuinely appreciative of the staff's efforts to prepare for her ceremony. 1 position away. James Fletcher executed his acknowledgement perfectly. "Your Majesty." Queen Camilla smiled at the young guard and continued forward. In 5 more steps she would reach Thomas's position. Thomas felt time slow down around him. The approaching footsteps seemed to echo like thunder in his ears. The palace corridor, which had been his second home for over 2 decades, suddenly felt like an arena where he was about to face the most important test of his life. Queen Camilla took the first step into the space directly in front of Thomas's position. According to protocol, this was the moment when he should stand even straighter, prepare for his acknowledgement, and ready himself to speak the required words. Instead, Thomas found himself thinking about Princess Diana's funeral. He remembered standing in the same palace as the entire nation mourned the loss of the people's princess. He remembered the flowers, the tears, and the overwhelming sense that something precious had been lost forever. Diana had represented something pure and genuine in the royal family, and her death had left a void that Thomas had never seen filled. Queen Camilla took the second step. She was now directly in front of Thomas, expecting his acknowledgement. Her eyes met his, and Thomas saw intelligence, determination, and perhaps even kindness in her gaze. For a split second he wavered, wondering if his years of resentment had been misplaced. But then he remembered the telephone conversations that had been leaked to the press, the years of secret meetings while Diana suffered in her marriage, and the way the royal family had seemingly moved on from Diana's memory, as if she had never existed. Queen Camilla took the third step, moving slightly past Thomas's position. The moment for his acknowledgement had arrived and was already beginning to pass. Mrs. Whitmore glanced in Thomas's direction, expecting to hear the familiar words "Your Majesty" spoken with proper respect and timing. Instead, Thomas remained completely silent. His mouth stayed closed, his head remained unbowed, and his eyes looked straight ahead rather than acknowledging the woman who had just passed his position. For the first time in 23 years of service, Palace Guard Thomas Mitchell had deliberately refused to follow royal protocol. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. Mrs. Whitmore's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but Thomas caught it. Commander Harrison, who was following the procession at a discreet distance, immediately noticed the breach of protocol. Queen Camilla herself seemed to hesitate for just a moment, as if waiting for an acknowledgement that never came. But her training in royal etiquette served her well. She continued walking without showing any visible reaction to Thomas's unprecedented act of defiance. As the procession moved past him and continued toward the throne room, Thomas felt a strange mixture of terror and relief wash over him. He had done it. He had taken his stand. He had refused to acknowledge Camilla as his queen, and now he would have to face whatever consequences followed. The corridor fell into an eerie silence after Queen Camilla's procession disappeared into the throne room. Thomas remained at his position, his body rigid with military precision, but his mind raced with the magnitude of what he had just done. 23 years of impeccable service had been shattered in a single moment of defiance that lasted no more than 5 seconds. James Fletcher, still standing at his nearby position, stared at Thomas with wide eyes filled with shock and confusion. The young guard's mouth hung open slightly as he tried to process what he had witnessed. In his 2 years of palace service, James had never seen anyone breach protocol so dramatically, and he struggled to understand how someone as experienced as Thomas could make such a devastating mistake. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, but these were different from the ceremonial procession that had just passed. These footsteps were quick, purposeful, and filled with barely controlled anger. Commander Harrison was returning, and Thomas knew that his career was about to face its most difficult challenge. Harrison appeared around the corner, his face flushed red with fury and embarrassment. As head of palace security, he was personally responsible for ensuring that every aspect of royal ceremonies proceeded without incident. Thomas's breach of protocol had not only violated centuries of tradition, but had also reflected poorly on Harrison's leadership and the entire Palace Guard unit. "Mitchell," Harrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Step away from your position immediately." Thomas moved with mechanical precision, stepping back from his ceremonial spot and standing at attention before his commanding officer. He kept his eyes focused straight ahead, knowing that looking Harrison in the face would only make the situation worse. "In 28 years of service to this palace, I have never witnessed such a disgraceful breach of protocol," Harrison said, his voice barely controlled. "You have embarrassed yourself, your unit, and the entire royal household. What possible explanation could you have for this inexcusable behavior?" Thomas remained silent. Any explanation he could offer would sound like an excuse, and he knew that his reasons would not be accepted by a man who had dedicated his life to serving the royal family without question. Harrison had worked his way up through the ranks by following orders perfectly, and expecting the same dedication from everyone under his command. "Answer me, Mitchell. Why did you refuse to acknowledge Her Majesty?" The words hung in the air between them. Thomas realized that this was his moment to either apologize and hope for mercy, or to stand by his convictions regardless of the consequences. He thought about his father's teachings about duty and honor, but he also thought about Princess Diana's memory and his own sense of right and wrong. "I could not bring myself to show that level of respect, sir," Thomas said quietly. Harrison's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Could not bring yourself? You are a palace guard, Mitchell. Your personal feelings are irrelevant to your duties. You serve the crown, not your own opinions." From down the corridor, Thomas could see other staff members beginning to gather. Word of his defiance was spreading quickly through the palace, and soon everyone would know about the guard who had refused to acknowledge Queen Camilla. Some looked shocked, others appeared curious, and a few seemed sympathetic to his position. Mrs. Whitmore appeared next to Commander Harrison, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of stress and concern. As deputy head of royal protocol, she was responsible for ensuring that ceremonies proceeded smoothly, and Thomas's actions had created a crisis that she had never encountered in her decades of service. "This is unprecedented," Mrs. Whitmore said, shaking her head. In all my years overseeing royal ceremonies, I have never seen such a deliberate breach of protocol. The implications are enormous. Thomas understood exactly what she meant. Royal ceremonies were not just formal events. They were symbolic demonstrations of loyalty, respect, and the social order that had governed Britain for centuries. When a palace guard refused to acknowledge a member of the royal family, it challenged the very foundation of the monarchy itself. We need to contain this situation immediately, Mrs. Whitmore continued. If word of this incident reaches the press, it could become a major scandal. The Queen Consort's first official ceremony has been compromised by one guard's personal agenda. Harrison nodded grimly. Mitchell will be suspended immediately pending a full investigation. We need to determine if this was a planned act of rebellion or a momentary lapse in judgment. As Thomas listened to them discuss his fate, he felt strangely calm. The worst had happened. His defiance had been witnessed, reported, and would soon be documented in official palace records. There was no going back now, no way to undo what he had done or pretend it had been a mistake. Sarah, the young maid who had spoken with Thomas earlier, appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd. Her face showed a mixture of concern and confusion as she tried to understand what had happened to the guard she had known as kind and reliable for the past 5 years. "Mr. Mitchell?" she called out softly. "Are you all right?" Before Thomas could respond, Harrison turned toward Sarah with a sharp expression. "Return to your duties immediately. This situation does not concern you." Sarah retreated quickly, but Thomas caught the worried look in her eyes. He realized that his actions would affect more than just his own career. They would impact everyone who had worked with him and considered him a friend. The palace was like a small community, and his breach of protocol would create ripples that touched every member of the staff. James Fletcher, still standing at his ceremonial position, looked torn between his duty to maintain his post and his desire to understand what had driven his colleague to such desperate action. Thomas could see the questions in the young guard's eyes. Questions about loyalty, duty, and the price of standing up for personal convictions. "Mitchell," Harrison said, his voice now coldly professional, "you will surrender your ceremonial sword and accompany me to the security office for questioning. Your access to all palace areas is hereby suspended until further notice." Thomas unbuckled his sword belt with steady hands and held it out to his commanding officer. The weight of the ceremonial blade had always reminded him of the honor and responsibility that came with his position. Now, as Harrison took the sword from his hands, Thomas felt 23 years of service ending in disgrace and controversy. As they walked toward the security office, Thomas caught glimpses of staff members whispering in doorways and watching from windows. Some looked angry, as if his defiance had insulted their own dedication to royal service. Others appeared thoughtful, perhaps wondering if they would have had the courage to make the same choice in his position. The throne room ceremony was continuing without him. Queen Camilla was proceeding with her official duties, and the palace was functioning exactly as it always had. But Thomas knew that something fundamental had changed. His act of defiance had introduced a crack in the seemingly perfect facade of royal protocol, and that crack would be talked about in palace corridors for years to come. Thomas Mitchell, the palace guard who had served faithfully for over 2 decades, had become the man who dared to refuse a queen. Whether history would remember him as a principled hero or a disloyal traitor remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. The security office in the lower level of Buckingham Palace felt like a prison cell to Thomas as he sat across from Commander Harrison and 2 officials he had never seen before. The windowless room was furnished with only a metal desk, 4 chairs, and a recording device that captured every word spoken. After decades of walking freely through the palace's grand corridors, Thomas now found himself confined to this sterile space, while his future was decided by others. One of the unfamiliar officials introduced himself as Sir Robert Thornton, the private secretary to His Majesty the King. Thornton was a tall, thin man in his 60s with silver hair, and the kind of authoritative presence that came from years of handling delicate royal matters. The second official was Ms. Jennifer Davies, the head of human resources for the royal household. She appeared to be in her 40s with sharp features and an expression that revealed nothing about her thoughts on Thomas's situation. "Mr. Mitchell," Sir Robert began, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm sure you understand the gravity of what occurred this morning. Your refusal to acknowledge Her Majesty Queen Camilla has created a situation that requires immediate attention from the highest levels of the royal household. Thomas nodded but remained silent. He had decided that the less he said during this interrogation, the better. Any attempt to explain his actions would likely be seen as making excuses or challenging the authority of the monarchy itself. Ms. Davies opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across the desk. Thomas recognized his employment records, performance evaluations, and commendation letters that had accumulated over his 23 years of service. The sight of those positive reports from his past made the current situation feel even more surreal. Your service record is exemplary, Ms. Davies said, scanning through the documents. Perfect attendance, outstanding performance ratings, multiple commendations for dedication and professionalism. Until today, you were considered one of our most reliable and trustworthy guards. This makes your behavior this morning all the more puzzling. Commander Harrison leaned forward, his frustration still evident despite the formal setting. Mitchell, you've served under 3 different monarchs without a single incident. You've protected members of the royal family during state visits, public appearances, and private ceremonies. What changed? What caused you to throw away decades of faithful service? Thomas felt the weight of their stares and the pressure to provide an explanation that would make sense to them. But how could he explain the years of internal conflict, the memories of Princess Diana, and his growing discomfort with serving someone he felt had not earned the title of queen through birth or noble service? Was this a planned protest? Sir Robert asked. Did someone encourage you to take this action? We need to know if this was an isolated incident or part of a larger conspiracy against the royal family. The word conspiracy hit Thomas like a physical blow. The idea that his personal struggle with conscience could be interpreted as part of some organized plot against the monarchy had never occurred to him. He realized that his actions could have implications far beyond his own career. No, sir, Thomas said firmly. This was entirely my own decision. No one else was involved. Ms. Davies made notes in a legal pad while studying Thomas's face carefully. Mr. Mitchell, your personnel file indicates that you served in the British Army before joining the palace staff. During your military service, did you ever have difficulty following orders or respecting authority? Thomas shook his head. Never. My military record was exemplary, just like my service here until today. Then what makes Queen Camilla different? Commander Harrison demanded. She holds the same position that Queen Elizabeth II held for 70 years. She deserves the same respect and recognition that you gave to every other member of the royal family. This was the question Thomas had been dreading, but also the one he felt most compelled to answer honestly. He took a deep breath and looked directly at Harrison for the first time since entering the room. I served Queen Elizabeth II because she was born to the throne and dedicated her entire life to her duties, Thomas said quietly. I served Princess Diana because she brought genuine compassion and humanity to the royal family. I cannot bring myself to show the same level of respect to someone who I believe damaged the institution I've spent my career protecting. The room fell silent. Sir Robert's expression hardened and Ms. Davies stopped writing in her notepad. Commander Harrison's face flushed red once again, but this time his anger seemed mixed with disappointment rather than pure fury. That is not your decision to make, Sir Robert said coldly. Your personal opinions about the worthiness of royal family members are completely irrelevant to your duties. You swore an oath to serve the crown, not to judge the individuals who wear it. Thomas knew that Sir Robert was right according to palace protocol and royal tradition. A guard's job was to serve and protect, not to evaluate the moral character of those he served. But Thomas also knew that he could not continue pretending to respect someone he genuinely believed had betrayed the values the monarchy was supposed to represent. I understand that my position is unacceptable, Thomas said. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate. Ms. Davies reopened the file folder and pulled out a document that Thomas recognized as a termination agreement. Mr. Mitchell, given the serious nature of your breach of protocol and your apparent unwillingness to acknowledge your error, the royal household has no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. The words hit Thomas with surprising force, even though he had expected this outcome. 23 years of his life gone in an instant because of 5 seconds of defiance. He thought about his small apartment near the palace, his daily routines, and the sense of purpose that had defined his adult life. All of it was ending because he could not bring himself to bow to a woman he did not believe deserved his respect. You will receive severance pay equivalent to 6 months' salary, Ms. Davies continued, along with your accumulated vacation time and pension benefits. However, you will be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing you from speaking publicly about royal family matters or your reasons for leaving palace service. Thomas stared at the document, realizing that they wanted to buy his silence along with his dismissal. The royal household was not just firing him, they were trying to ensure that his act of defiance would never become public knowledge or inspire others to question their own loyalty to the crown. What if I refuse to sign the agreement? Thomas asked. Sir Robert's expression became even more stern. Then you would receive only the minimum severance required by law, and we would be forced to consider legal action for breach of your employment contract and violation of royal security protocols. Thomas understood the implied threat. They were offering him a choice between comfortable silence and potentially devastating legal consequences. After 2 decades of faithful service, he was being treated like a criminal simply because he could not bring himself to acknowledge someone he believed unworthy of royal status. Commander Harrison, who had remained quiet during the legal discussion, finally spoke again. Mitchell, you still have a chance to apologize and request reinstatement. If you formally acknowledge your error and commit to following all protocols without question, the king might consider allowing you to keep your position. Thomas looked around the room at the 3 officials who controlled his fate. He could see that they genuinely believed they were offering him a reasonable opportunity to save his career. They expected him to be grateful for the chance to apologize and return to his duties. But Thomas realized that apologizing would mean betraying everything he had stood for during that crucial moment in the corridor. It would mean admitting that his convictions were less important than his job security, and that Princess Diana's memory meant nothing compared to royal protocol. I cannot apologize for following my conscience, Thomas said quietly. I will accept termination, rather than pretend to respect someone I believe betrayed the institution I've spent my life serving. The finality of his words seemed to echo in the small room, sealing his fate and ending his career as a palace guard forever. 3 hours later, Thomas Mitchell walked out of Buckingham Palace for the final time as an employee of the royal household. He carried a small cardboard box containing his personal belongings, a framed photograph of his father in his royal guard uniform, a commendation letter from Queen Elizabeth II, and a few other mementos from his 23 years of service. The autumn rain had started while he was in the security office, and now the London streets glistened under the gray afternoon sky. At the palace gates, Thomas paused and looked back at the building that had been his life for more than 2 decades. The red brick facade and iconic balcony looked the same as they had that morning when he arrived for what he thought would be just another day of duty. But everything had changed in those few seconds when he chose conscience over protocol. A small group of tourists stood outside the gates, taking photographs and hoping to catch a glimpse of royal activity. They paid no attention to Thomas, seeing him as just another palace employee leaving work. None of them could know that they were witnessing the end of a career that had been destroyed by 5 seconds of silent defiance. As Thomas walked toward the nearest underground station, he found himself thinking about the conversation he would need to have with his elderly mother that evening. She had been so proud when he joined the palace staff, often telling her friends about her son, who served the queen. Now he would have to explain why he had thrown away everything she had admired about his career. The train ride to his flat passed in a blur of familiar stations and anonymous faces. Thomas stared out the window at the London landscape, wondering how many other people on the train had ever faced a moment when their personal convictions clashed so dramatically with their professional obligations. How many had chosen duty over conscience? How many had chosen principle over security? When Thomas reached his small apartment near Victoria Station, he found an envelope that had been slipped under his door. Inside was a handwritten note from Sarah, the young maid who had spoken with him that morning. Mr. Mitchell, the note read, I heard about what happened today. I don't pretend to understand all the reasons behind your decision, but I wanted you to know that many of us will remember you as a good man who always treated the staff with kindness and respect. I hope you find peace with whatever comes next. Sarah. Thomas read the note 3 times before setting it on his kitchen table. In all the chaos and formal interrogation of the afternoon, he had forgotten that his actions would affect the people who had worked alongside him for years. Sarah's simple message reminded him that his 23 years of service had meant something to the people who knew him as more than just a uniform and a protocol violation. Over the next several days, Thomas discovered that word of his defiance had spread throughout the palace staff, despite the royal household's efforts to contain the story. He received visits from several former colleagues who wanted to understand his decision and express their own conflicted feelings about royal service. James Fletcher, the young guard who had witnessed Thomas's refusal to acknowledge Queen Camilla, came to his apartment on the third evening after the incident. The young man looked troubled and uncertain as he sat in Thomas's living room. "I keep thinking about what you did," James said quietly. "I've been trying to understand how someone with your record could make such a choice." "Were you trying to make some kind of political statement?" Thomas shook his head. "It wasn't political, James, it was personal. I reached a point where I could no longer pretend to respect someone I believed had damaged the institution I was supposed to protect." James looked confused. "But the royal family isn't perfect. Queen Elizabeth made mistakes. Prince Charles had his scandals, and even Princess Diana had her flaws. If we only served perfect people, we wouldn't serve anyone." The young guard's words forced Thomas to examine his own motivations more deeply. Had his decision really been about protecting the monarchy, or had it been about his own inability to forgive and move forward? Had he held Queen Camilla to an impossible standard while overlooking the human weaknesses of other royal family members he had served without question? "Maybe you're right," Thomas admitted. "Maybe I was expecting something from Queen Camilla that I never expected from anyone else. But I couldn't bring myself to bow to her, knowing what I knew about how she came to that position." James left that evening with more questions than answers, but Thomas could see that their conversation had planted seeds of doubt about blind loyalty and unquestioning service. The young guard would have to decide for himself what kind of palace servant he wanted to be. 2 weeks after his termination, Thomas received an unexpected phone call from Commander Harrison. The security chief's voice was formal but not hostile as he delivered a surprising message. "Mitchell, I'm calling to inform you that your actions have prompted discussions at the highest levels of the royal household about the expectations we place on palace staff. Some officials believe that your 23 years of faithful service should count for something. Even in light of your recent breach of protocol." Thomas waited for Harrison to continue, unsure where this conversation might lead. "While your termination stands, the royal household has decided to offer you a position with a private security firm that handles protection for former royal family members and government officials. It would be similar work with better pay, and your palace service record would be a significant asset." The offer surprised Thomas completely. He had expected to be blacklisted from any security work related to the royal family or government. Instead, they were providing him with an opportunity to continue using his skills in a different environment. "Why would they make this offer?" Thomas asked. Harrison was quiet for a moment before answering. "Because some people in leadership positions believe that a man who stands by his principles, even at great personal cost, might be exactly the kind of person they want protecting important individuals. Your defiance showed poor judgment in timing and setting, but it also showed integrity." After ending the call with Harrison, Thomas sat in his apartment thinking about the unexpected turn his life had taken. His act of defiance had cost him his palace career, but it had also opened a door to a future he had never considered. More importantly, it had forced him to examine his own beliefs about loyalty, duty, and the courage required to act on personal convictions. 3 months later, Thomas started his new job with Sovereign Protection Services, providing security for retired government officials and members of the extended royal family. His new colleagues knew about his palace service, but not about the specific circumstances of his departure. The non-disclosure agreement he had eventually signed ensured that his moment of defiance would remain a private matter between him and the royal household. But sometimes, when Thomas read news reports about Queen Camilla's charitable work or public appearances, he wondered if his act of defiance had been worth the price he had paid. He had stood up for his principles and maintained his personal integrity, but he had also lost a career that had defined his identity for over 2 decades. In the end, Thomas concluded that he had made the only choice he could live with. Whether history would vindicate his decision or condemn it remained to be seen. But Thomas Mitchell, the palace guard who had refused to bow to a queen, could face himself in the mirror each morning, knowing that he had been true to his own conscience, regardless of the consequences. The corridor where he had made his stand continued to echo with the footsteps of other guards. Other ceremonies and other moments when duty and conscience would inevitably clash. But for one brief moment in royal history, a single guard had chosen to let his silence speak louder than any words of acknowledgement ever could.